Hello, everyone. I want to begin this video with this simple question. If I take in my hand here a standard English Bible, Christian Bible, got the Old Testament and the New Testament, and if I look at the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, as we scholars call it, the Jewish Bible, this is translated into English from an ancient Hebrew manuscript, in fact, several manuscripts that are then compared to get the text of the English and translated. But those texts date to about 1000 AD or CE. That's the Middle Ages. What if you had copies that would go back, let's say, to the time of Jesus? Copies of these same manuscripts, and they suddenly appeared. They were discovered, and you would begin to read them. And I think your main obvious question would be, wow, this is over 1,000 years earlier. I think you would want to compare them and ask, what are the differences? What are the similarities? So that's what I began to do in the previous video. I titled it The Top 10 Differences Between the Traditional Old Testament or Hebrew Bible and copies found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls date to, in some cases, over 100 years before the time of Jesus. So, what sort of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Genesis, Exodus, and so forth were they reading? Was it identical? Are there some differences? Are there minor differences? Are there major differences? How would they compare? Well, we now have in English, and you can even get this book and do your own work on this, English translations of those ancient manuscripts of the Dead Sea Scroll Library. These would be copies of the Bible. We don't have complete copies of every book, but the book of Isaiah is complete. The book of Habakkuk is complete, and several others are complete. We have the Psalms and so forth. But if you put them all together, you can see it's a substantial volume, and we could call it the Dead Sea Scroll Bible. So these ancient Essenes, as they're usually called, this sect of Judaism living along the western side of the Dead Sea, hid their manuscripts in caves when the Romans invaded the country and destroyed Jerusalem and came down to Jericho, and they fled south. And so we now have discovered since the 1940s and into the 1950s their library, and it's got biblical books in it. So in the series that I started last time, I asked the question, what would be the top 10 differences that you would find? Now, there are thousands of differences, but I picked 10 and I put them in order of importance. I started with minor things, the kind of thing you would typically find, and I went on down and I did the first five. So today I'm going to do five, four, three, two, one, and number one and two and three are going to be really significant differences. So I have my slide presentation. I'll share my screen here. So we'll pick up where we left off from last time. Here's a representation of the oldest Hebrew manuscript that goes into translating the Hebrew Bible. It's called the Leningrad Codex. As I said, it's from about 1000 AD or CE, Middle Ages. And here is a copy of Isaiah from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we date that usually to about 100 BC or BCE. So last time I went through all this in the previous video. I'm not going to repeat it all, but here's a standard Hebrew Bible. Here's the book I just showed you. We also have copies of the Hebrew Bible translated into Greek that date to maybe 200 BC, and that would be earlier than the standard Hebrew text as well. So we have two other things we can compare to the traditional text. Here's what this looks like, just a page from it, so you get an idea of what it's like. You might want to buy a copy. Here's Isaiah chapter 2, and every time there's a difference, you see those italics with little numbers? You can go down and see the differences. So here on a single page, you can see there's a dozen or more differences. Do they amount to anything? Well, Sometimes they're very, very small, and other times they're quite significant. So here's number 10. You can go back and hear the details in that previous video on my channel of the first five, counting down from 10. It's from the book of Genesis. I have a translation of Genesis, and in my translation, I've included in the notes all the differences from the Dead Sea Scrolls that are significant. So if you want to get a copy of that, there's the link, jamestabor.com/books. It's a very different translation, not just Dead Sea Scrolls, but all kinds of other readings and ways of translating. It's much more literal. I call it the transparent English Bible because the idea is you'll peer through the English and be able to see what the Hebrew was like behind it. Okay, and then number 9, this has to do with numbers, 70 persons, 75 persons, how many people went down to Egypt, differences, how tall was Goliath. Number 7, this is actually a chunk of material that's missing from our standard Hebrew Bible. And I think it was original. It somehow just got dropped out. And if you put it back in, this story in First Samuel makes a lot more sense. Number 6 is very important to Christians because in the standard Hebrew text, it talks about David, King David is being persecuted, and he says, dogs surround me, a pack of evil ones closes in on me like lions, and then there's no verb. Like lions, my hands and feet. So it's understood, like lions, what? They claw me, they claw my hands and feet. But in the Dead Sea Scroll copy, dogs are all around, a gang of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. So you see the claws of the dogs are digging into your hands and feet. And Christians later use this in the New Testament to say, well, this isn't just King David. This actually prophetically refers to Jesus because his hands and feet were pierced. Anyway, now this is new. Now we're going to 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. First of all, if I open this Bible again, right here, and I go to Psalms, here I am right here. I get to the end, last verse of Psalms. I know you can't see this, but look in the Bible if you have a Bible. 150 Psalms. Now, we've known long before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered that some versions of translations of the Hebrew Bible, such as the Septuagint, we call it the LXX, the Greek translation of the Hebrew, has that extra psalm. It's just that our oldest Hebrew copy from the Leningrad Codex, 1000 AD or CE, doesn't have that psalm. It's an extra psalm. And it's ascribed to David. And he's talking about fighting with Goliath. He was small, youngest in his father's house. He tended his father's sheep. Talks about my hands made a harp, my fingers fashioned a lyre. It's kind of biographical. And then he says, and who will declare it to my Lord? The Lord himself, he hears. It was he who sent his messenger and took me from my father's sheep and anointed me with anointing oil, remember, to make him king. My brothers were handsome and tall, but the Lord wasn't pleased with them. I went out to meet the Philistine, that's Goliath, and he cursed me by his idols. But I drew his own sword and beheaded him and removed reproach from the people of Israel. So there's a psalm that recounts the story of David and Goliath. And it occurs in quite a few versions, but it's not in our oldest copy of the Hebrew Bible. These are all translations. But should it be there? Does it go back anciently? Well, Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest thing we have, and we take a look. So, in fact, there is a Psalm 151 in two copies of the Dead Sea Scroll, two versions. One is A, one is B. So the Dead Sea Scrolls do have the extra psalm, but as you read it, first of all, you can see that it's a lot longer, and it does start and sounds kind of similar. I was smaller than my brothers. His father made him the shepherd of a flock and so forth. And he made musical instruments. But as you go on down, this is not about Goliath. This is about Samuel. The prophet Samuel anointed him and chose him, even though his brothers were handsome and tall and they had beautiful hair. The Lord did not choose them, but he sent and fetched me from behind the flock and anointed me, and so forth, and made him king. And Psalm 151b goes on with even more, and it does seem to talk about the Goliath story of slaying the giant. But this is completely different. Should we add it to the Bible? Is it an extra psalm? Why not? There are some new editions of the Bible with the Apocrypha where they have put Psalm 51 in. This edition here that I have has it, but it doesn't have the Dead Sea Scroll version. So there's a real question. When you say, how do the Dead Sea Scrolls differ from the Standard Bible? This would be one of the most significant differences because it's obviously a completely different text. Number 4, Isaiah 53 is about the suffering servant. Christians read this and they take it as a prophecy of the sufferings of Jesus. By oppression and judgment, he was taken away. As for his generation, who considered that he was cut off from the land of the living, for the transgression of my people, the blow was upon them. He made his grave with the wicked, with a rich man in his death. And so I color coded some of the differences. And you'll have to decide are they significant or not. But this is a very important passage for Christians and Jews who read this as the sufferings of the servant Israel, the people Israel. But notice here you have my people, his people. Is that important? Um, he made his grave with the wicked. They made his grave with the wicked. With rich people, his tomb, with a rich man in his deaths. So you can see there are differences. Now, here, though, I think is one that does really stand out. He will see from the travail of his soul. So this is that suffering servant. But it seems like you need an object. What is it that he's going to see? From the travail of his soul, he will see, and it doesn't tell what he's going to see. But whatever he sees, he's satisfied. But notice in the Dead Sea Scroll copy, out of the travail of his soul, he will see light. That implies that he's suffers, he's buried, and then he sees light. Would hint at something like resurrection if you're in darkness and suddenly you see light. And so you can see that there are other kinds of differences. These are more minor. He bore the sin of many. It says the sins, made intercession for transgressors, for their transgressions. So minor, and yet verse 11, I rated it as number 4. It does seem to make a difference. And this is that complete copy of Isaiah that was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And when people would read it, they would read this, not this. Out of the travail of his soul, he will see light. Number 3. Now, this is really getting different. Those were kind of minor differences, but verse 11, as I said, I think was more significant. This is from the Song of Moses, and there are two main differences that really stand out. It's in the book of Deuteronomy in the Torah, chapter 32, verse 8. When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, that's God separating all the nations. When he separated the sons of Adam, all the children of Adam and Eve, he set the bounds of the people, like where are they going to live? This goes back to Genesis chapter 10 according to the number of the children of Israel, which is kind of odd to try to figure out what that means. The bounds of their habitation, as if Israel is strategic and everybody else is kind of grouped around, maybe. Praise his people, O you nations, for he avenges the blood of his servants and takes vengeance on his adversaries and will atone for the land of his people. Okay? Now, the Dead Sea Scroll copy of Deuteronomy, and there's several copies, but this is one of them. Same thing, when the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people. Notice, look at this, according to the number of the sons of God, the B'nai Elohim. probably referring to the angels, the Septuagint or LXX, the 70 we call it. It has the angels of God, not the children of Israel. And then it goes on to say, notice here, praise his people, O you nations, rejoice, O heavens, together with him, bow down to him, all you gods, these other gods of the nations, for he will avenge the blood of his sons, will take vengeance on his adversaries, and will recompense those who hate him. So you don't have that phrase is dropped out, and will atone for the land of his people. So completely different reading and an addition. So that's number three. You ready for number two? Number two, 10 Commandments. This is the fourth commandment. Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy, and so forth. If one asks, what is the reason the Sabbath day is given? This command to rest every seventh day on the seventh day. Verse 15 of Deuteronomy, and this is in the book of Deuteronomy, you shall remember that you were a servant in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. So that's the way our Deuteronomy would read today. If I open this up to Deuteronomy, that's how it reads. But notice this, in the Dead Sea Scroll version, it says a reason for you to keep the Sabbath, not just because you were brought out of Egypt. Why would that cause you to keep the Sabbath? Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to keep the Sabbath and hallow it for, like, here's the reason. In 6 days, the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. So the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So here you get the Sabbath going back to creation, not the Exodus from Egypt. So that means that it's seen as a more universal day for all humankind. Now, some of you might know the story down here of Jesus in Mark 2, chapter 27. The Sabbath was made for humankind. Is Jesus reading a copy of Deuteronomy that has this in it? Because he's always quoting Isaiah and Deuteronomy. Did his Deuteronomy scroll have this addition where he could say the Sabbath is made for humankind? And here it is. 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, rested on the seventh. Therefore he blessed it as the Sabbath day and hallowed it, made it holy. I think it's very possible. Now, the book of Exodus does have this idea, but it's in Exodus, not Deuteronomy. You see the difference. And all the other versions lack it. But here we have a Dead Sea Scroll that contains it. Now, the reason I made this number two is because the Sabbath day is one of the 10 Commandments. And many people think of it as a Jewish thing, but here's a version of Deuteronomy that makes it clear, yes, it's Jewish, but also it goes back to the creation, and Jesus seems to know a version like that. Now, here's something that makes this even more interesting. There is another Dead Sea Scroll that has this same reading of Deuteronomy, copy of Deuteronomy, but it wasn't found in the 1940s and 50s. It was found on the east side of the Dead Sea in a cave, in a jar, wrapped in linen, sticky on the outside, just like our Dead Sea Scrolls. But look at this, in 1878. And it was dismissed as a forgery. It was found by an antiquities dealer. His name was Moses Shapira. We call it the Shapira Scroll. And I wrote the foreword to this book, which talks about that scroll. It has disappeared, but we have transcriptions of it. And I think we're going to be able to maybe recover it. And Ross K. Nichols has written this book here, The Moses Scroll, reopening the most controversial case in the history of biblical scholarship. And once the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the 1940s and 50s, people remembered this Shapira scroll, as it's called, the Moses scroll, and they began to wonder, well, wait a minute. It's a representation of not the entire book of Deuteronomy, but the first person speech of Moses. And when it gets to the Ten Commandments, God Himself is speaking. He calls Himself Elohim. I'm Elohim, your God. But look right here as you go on reading. Sanctify the seventh day. 6 days I made the heavens and the earth and all that is in them, and ceased on the seventh day. Therefore you shall cease, you, your animal, and all that is yours. I'm Elohim. So it's worded a little differently, but the reason this is a version of the Ten Commandments, it has the other commandments as well, in somewhat different version, and it includes the reason, and it is a fragment from a version of Deuteronomy, maybe even earlier than the ones preserved in this previous slide right here. This is from a Dead Sea Scroll. It was found in Cave 4. It's called 4Q Deuteronomy. This is found in 1878, and it also gives that as the reason for keeping the Sabbath. So if you're interested in this, it's a mystery story. It's fascinating. Did we maybe find a Dead Sea Scroll before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found way back in the 19th century? I wrote an article with another scholar, Idan Dershowitz. He and I both believe, along with Ross Nichols, who wrote that book, that the Shapira scrolls were probably authentic. And here's a picture of the opening of that article. You can get it and read it free of charge if you go to my page at academia.edu and just look for James D. Tabor, my page, and you can download and read my arguments for this being authentic. And here's the link to get the book. This will take you to Nichols' site, jamestabor.com, Moses Scroll Book, jamestabor.com, Moses Scroll Lecture. This is a lecture that I gave, so you can get the article, the book, and the lecture. I put that number 2 mainly because it's the Ten Commandments, also because it seems to be a version Jesus would have known, and finally because we have this other Dead Sea Scroll that's now disappeared that I think was authentic, found in the 19th century, that includes this reason for keeping the Sabbath. And that would make the Sabbath more universal, that it's not the Jewish Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for humankind, as Jesus is quoted as saying in the Gospel of Mark when he's asked about keeping the Sabbath. So that's number 2. And now we go to number 1. I made this the most significant countdown, number 1. So this is in the last book of the Old Testament, the way Christians order the books, the book of Malachi, the last of the Hebrew prophets, chapter 3, verse 1. Behold, I send my messenger. This is God speaking, and he will prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom you seek, it's the word Adon. It's not the divine name God. It's talking about the Master, the Lord, like people call Jesus the Lord. He will suddenly come to his temple, the messenger of the covenant, whom you desire. Behold, he comes, says the Lord of hosts. That's God, the Lord of hosts, all caps. But who can abide the day of his coming? So this is a prophecy of this final messenger coming at the end of the age and preparing the way, as it's called here. When you open up the New Testament, what do you find? Mark 1, verse 2, our earliest gospel, John the Baptist arrives on the scene out by the Dead Sea, and he says, I'm the messenger. Behold, the messenger that prepares the way in the wilderness. So he's claiming to be this one. However, in the Dead Sea Scroll copy of Malachi, guess what? You get 2 figures, not one, 2 messiahs. Let's read it. Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. And the Lord, whom you seek, they will suddenly come to God's temple, his temple, and the messenger of the covenant, whom you desire. Behold, he comes, says the Lord, or Jehovah of hosts. But notice, but who can endure them when they come? Number one, most important difference in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Malachi in the Dead Sea Scrolls prophesies two messiahs coming, not just one. I call them messiahs, anointed ones, chosen ones. One is more of a priest, the other is more of a king. We find that in other texts of the Hebrew Bible. It's mentioned in Zechariah chapter 6 that the future king, the Messiah, will sit on a throne, and at his side will be an anointed priest. So we know from reading other Dead Sea Scrolls, not the biblical scrolls, but where they talk about their own beliefs, they talk about the coming of a Davidic Messiah. They call him the Messiah, the branch of David, but also a priestly Messiah from the line of Aaron, Moses' brother, which is the priestly lineage. And so you actually have two figures. Now, if in the time of Jesus, people were reading this rather than this, if this was the version they were reading and studying, as they were in the Dead Sea Scroll community, when John the Baptist comes, they would ask, are you the one, or should we look for another? In other words, is there just one messenger, or is there a messenger who prepares the way for the Lord whom you will seek, as Christians began to believe? You see that? And they then come together. Notice they will come when they come. One comes and then prepares the way for the other. So you can see how this fits much more the understanding of the Dead Sea Scroll community and of the early Christian community. I think this is likely the text that they were reading and the kind of text that they were reading. Let me stop the share and just summarize for you here. Now, in the countdown from 10 down to 1, I said I ordered them in terms of importance. So you see what I'm doing here. I think they're all interesting and important, but I think what was it? Number two was how tall was Goliath? Was he 6.5 feet or was he 9.5 feet? How many people came into slavery in the time of Jacob when he went down to Egypt? Was it 70 or 75? Different kinds of wording differences. Sometimes a story might drop out that is included and so forth. But when you get down to the suffering servant song, when you get down to what is the reason that God commanded the Sabbath day as one of the Ten Commandments, is it universal for all humankind, or is it just a Jewish thing? And when you get down to two messiahs being expected in the time of Jesus rather than just one, two figures, two anointed figures, I put those as the most influential or the most important. So I hope you'll get your own copy of this. It's a real adventure to read because you can just open it anywhere. It's arranged like the Hebrew Bible. These are all the texts that survived, and you can begin doing your own work on what are the differences between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the standard text. So when you hear somebody say, yes, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered and they're 1,000 years earlier or more, and you compare them to the traditional texts that we've had for the past 1,000 years, and they're almost identical. That's not the case. They're not almost identical. There are significant differences, and you can do your own study, and you will have the equipment to do it. So we don't have to guess or wonder how are they different. This is published now. The introductory video to this little mini series, it's 3 videos. I did an introduction, then I did part 1, the first 5 differences, and this is part 2, the final 5, down to number 1. And in the intro, I pointed out that there's this big discussion on YouTube now, and many of you might have picked up on it if you're regular YouTube viewers, because a certain evangelical scholar went on Joe Rogan, Wes Huff, and maybe just a slip of the tongue, he said if you compare Isaiah from the Dead Sea Scrolls and the traditional Isaiah and put them together, they're word for word identical. He didn't even say almost. But even if you say almost identical, I can turn right now to Isaiah. Just happened to open to it. And you could just every page, there are differences. Are they significant? Are they not significant? Well, they're differences. You decide. You can be a reader of the Dead Sea Scroll Bible and see what you think. I think it's fascinating. I've also got a course called Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'll put the link to it in the description if you'd like to take that course. It's online, you work at your own pace, and you will get many, many more details about all of these things. If you didn't watch or hear the introduction and part one of the 10 differences, go back and take a look and you'll get the whole picture. See you later.